Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 20, and welcome to another edition in our ongoing comparative decolonization series. In recent lectures, we've charted decolonization in China, in Africa. Here today, we'll turn our attention to Asia, specifically South Asia, and tell the story of the decolonization of India, its fracturing into two nation states, India and Pakistan, and in doing so, not only give another narrative of decolonization, but help you understand some of the current geopolitics in South Asia now in the early 21st century. And then, at the very end of this lecture, I will offer some reflections on comparative decolonization, specifically comparing the story we're about to hear regarding decolonization in India with our recent lecture on decolonization in another part of Asia, in China. We will, at the end of this lecture, compare decolonization in China with decolonization in India and Pakistan, just in case some jerk asks you about that on an exam coming soon. So this is our third look at decolonization, turning our attention to another part of Asia. At the end of this lecture, we'll reflect a little bit on this recent series on decolonization. So buckle up. Here we go. Great Britain first began its imperial efforts in India in the 1760s through the efforts of a private enterprise, the East India Company. The very first British efforts to control this part of the world, to establish colonial power in India, began through a private effort of a trading company, the East India Company, that was seeking to gain access to certain materials in demand in Great Britain and around the world that could be extracted from this region. So again, it's that economic motivation for imperialism, in this case, as early as the mid-18th century, where the East India Company wanted to gain a monopoly over key resources extracted from India, things like tea that were in demand around the globe. So the story of British colonial rule begins as early as the 1760s in India through the effort of this private enterprise, the East India Company, establishing control over certain regions in India. This is comparable to what we talked about earlier in regards to Cecil Rhodes, how a private enterprise of a private profiteer would eventually lead to formal British control over a region. We saw that in the story of British colonization of South Africa, and it's also the case here in India. So Great Britain first established its rule in India in the 1760s. This is one of the reasons why Great Britain can brush off the loss of the 13 American colonies in the aftermath of the American Revolution in the early 1780s, when Great Britain willfully accepts the defeat and loss of the American colonies. Great Britain could shake that off, brush that off, the loss of the 13 American colonies, and still remain the wealthiest nation on earth for more than a century to come, largely because it had an empire beginning in the 1760s in India that would be very profitable to Great Britain. In establishing control over India, the East India Company established a form of rule that involved a rule directly by a governor general, or later known as a viceroy, and the board of directors of the East India Company that served as a council that advised the viceroy in regards to governance. In 1858, there's a rebellion in India against British rule, and that would urge the British government to take a much more direct, hands-on approach to governing India. So initially, this was an effort of a private enterprise, the East India Company, driven by economic motivations to gain access to tea and other commodities to be sold around the globe. The Indian people rebel against those efforts in 1858, and the response by Great Britain was to turn the screws, take a much more assertive and direct approach, appropriate control from the East India Company, and now directly through the British government, rule in India, making India a crown colony that is directly governed by the British Crown. And so the story that began with the East India Company now becomes more formal form of rule through the British government. The British relied on that indirect mode that we saw in Africa, where they had, as part of their bureaucracy, their government apparatus, local people who worked in concert with British officials who were either on the ground in India or back in London. So you get what we have seen in many, many instances prior in regards to European colonialism, a very stratified society, where at the top you have British-born citizens in India governing through the colonial government. Then you have local people, educated Indians, who are co-opted into the government bureaucracy, and then the many, the poor, peasant, landless class in India, who are the largest in number, but are completely closed off to centers of power, authority, education, opportunity. It is a society of haves and have-nots that, again, follows many of the models that we saw earlier in regards to European colonialism. But in order to run such a bureaucracy, you do need local people. And this is also something we have seen in earlier stories, particularly of decolonization. In order to colonize a land far, far away from the mother country, Great Britain relative to India, you need people on the ground to govern, make this possible, and the British in particular preferred this methodology of indirect rule. Not a lot of British subjects in India. Instead, build up a system that allows people there in India to help govern and run the colony. Well, those people have to be educated, they have to be able to function in regards to this bureaucracy, and so necessarily over time there develops an educated group of Indian people who are necessary to the function of colonialism and colonial government, but start to develop through their exposure to education, modern ideas, and of course the contagion of nationalism that's spreading around the globe in the 19th century, a commitment to independence. So colonialism needs educated local people to work, particularly in the British model of indirect rule. You need local people on the ground who can staff the colonial bureaucracy. But what happens is when you educate people to fulfill that necessary role, they develop their own commitments to modern ideals of nationalism, independence, modernity, and that becomes the foundation, the seedbed for efforts at decolonization. This is what happens in Africa. It's what happens in China when we talked about Sun Yat-sen. This is, again, a very common story that we've seen. It's one of the ironies of colonialism. To colonize and conquer some landscape far removed from the mother country, you necessarily have to create a context by which decolonization can go forward, meaning that you educate local people to help run your colonial government, but in the process of educating them, exposing them to modern ideas, they become keenly aware of how underdeveloped their own nation is. They become keenly aware of alternative ways of governing, and they become keenly aware that they'll never achieve the development and the independence that they seek under colonialism, that the British will never treat them as equals. And so this spearheads an effort at independence, and it becomes increasingly concerted and deliberate. It becomes increasingly explicit. As early as 1885, the Indian National Congress formed, lobbying the British government to put India on a path towards independence and self-rule. And where did this movement come from? It did not come from the poor, landless class, though they certainly would have loved to be rid of the British. Instead, it actually comes from the people who are closest to colonial rule, the educated intellectual class who wants for India what is actively denied through colonialism: independence, self-governance, a chance to use the resources in India for the betterment and development of the Indian people rather than British corporations. And so the Indian National Congress is the first stage in the effort to decolonize India. As early as the late 19th century, this movement is developing among intellectuals, reformers. It is very demonstrative of how these ideas are circulating, influencing, infecting people around the globe. In the late 19th century, you have a liberation movement in Cuba. You have an independence movement in the Philippines. You have a nationalist movement in Serbia. In earlier lectures, we saw the consequences of this in various parts of the globe. And here it is now in India. However, the colony, the crown colony of India, encompassed a number of linguistic, ethnic, and religious groups. And that included a very large Muslim population that worried about what an independent India would look like with a Hindu majority. The Indian National Congress was comprised of Hindu intellectuals. They were the majority in the British colony of India. However, there was a very significant population of Muslims who were in this colony claimed by the British, and they feared that if the Indian National Congress gets its way and is able to, either through force or persuasion, convince the British to leave, that would mean that we Muslim inhabitants, citizens of a newly independent India, would be a permanent minority and lack political voice. We too want independence. We too want self-rule. We too want the ability to pursue a life and nation of our own making. And it will be difficult to do that if we are overwhelmed by a Hindu majority that may have different pursuits, different inclinations, and with their majority, with the weight of numbers on their side, forever stymie and limit the aspirations and goals of this very sizable Muslim minority. And so in response to that, the Muslim League formed in 1906 to call for the political interests of a sizable Muslim minority population in the British colony of India, so that if independence goes forward, their interests are heard. And then eventually the Muslim League said the only way to really secure those interests was to form a separate nation state that would be majority Muslim. And so now decolonization takes a very crucial turn in India, where what we're talking about in regards to ending British colonial rule is the creation not just of one new independent state, but two independent states. And this comes from the sincere concerns of Muslims in India that the British leave. Well, that won't work for us because we will be forever locked out of political power as a permanent minority. What we need for our goals of independence, self-rule, self-determination is our own separate state where we will be the majority. And so this is unique to the story of decolonization in India. We have talked in earlier instances how when European rule ends, the Europeans leave, and they leave behind these very fractured societies. And there's this effort to hold together the old colony as a new nation state. And as we saw recently in our lecture on Africa, that often led to one-man dictatorships who could only hold together that newly independent state through coercive power. Well, what we have in India is a call for ending European rule and forming two nation states to fit with the different religious differences in the British Indian colony. So, how to decolonize? How will India decolonize with now these different concerns that come out of the heterogeneous religious population in India? And look, we're only scratching the surface here. This is a quick lecture in a 10-week course trying to cover 120 years of human history. Of course, there are many other religious groups in India, the Sikhs, many different offshoots of Islam and Hinduism. So India is this really remarkable story. It is so heterogeneous, and not just in terms of Muslim and Hindu, but there are many other religions. There are many, many linguistic groups. So one of the unique challenges in decolonization, hopefully that we've seen already in our different case studies of it, is this question of how do you hold together heterogeneous societies when the one force that could hold things together through the colonial period, the colonial power, leaves. And in India, this is true because India is a remarkably heterogeneous society. But it's also unique to India in the sense that they actually sought an independence that would manifest into separate states. World War I played a key role in further expanding commitment to decolonization, building a broader coalition of Indian people committed to ending British rule, vaulting it beyond just a movement of intellectuals. Many Indians fought in World War I for the British. They went to Europe. They were there in the trenches. They experienced that brutal fighting that we talked about much earlier in the class. They were fighting for Great Britain. They were fighting for the mother country. They were sacrificing. They were serving. But they experienced a form of service that again failed to recognize that sacrifice. Many of the Indian soldiers were treated poorly by British officers who saw them as cannon fodder, as expendable. Quite often the Indian soldiers would be sent out first in the first wave when the enemy was most equipped and when death and casualty was more likely. And so the Indian soldiers, who saw themselves as brave men fighting under the British flag, were keenly reminded of the way in which the British truly saw them as inferior through that lens of racism, social Darwinism that is so central to colonialism. So the Indian soldiers were subject to racism, subject to the brutalities of war. They were treated as inferior. They were tasked with the deadliest efforts of soldiering. And so this was a lesson to them that they'll never be treated as equals. That despite fighting for Great Britain, despite putting their lives on the line for the mother country, they were seen as inferior. Then World War I did great damage to the Indian economy, as so many resources were funneled to the war effort, and that caused great scarcity in India and runaway inflation. So the Indian people, whether they were on the Western Front, fighting in World War I, sacrificing and serving a nation that was callous to their sacrifice, or at home in India, suffered mightily during World War I. And all this did was deepen, expand the commitment to ending British colonialism. It stoked resentment. It was a sharp reminder to the Indian people that their role in the British Empire was one in which they would be abused and suffer, whether it was at home owing to the effects of the war on the colonial economy, or in the course of war. They were keenly aware that this was an asymmetrical relationship. It was a relationship in which the Indian people suffered, and from that came a call for self-determination, independence, freedom from these asymmetries of sacrifice and misery. So there's this mounting pressure that's now growing, expanding beyond the nationalist groups we described in the previous slide, reaching everyday Indian people who are increasingly convinced because of the ill effects of World War I that the British must leave. And then at the very end of World War I, there's a very key event in the story of Indian decolonization. Sometimes it takes flashpoint events to push things over, to crystallize a sea of sentiment below. We've seen that as well at various stages and moments in the class. In the case of Indian decolonization, the flashpoint event is the Amritsar massacre, when in April of 1919 there was a peaceful protest of 10,000 Indians against the British arrest and deportation of two prominent nationalist leaders. Two nationalist leaders who were fanning the flames of this popular sentiment and movement, so strong and revived with, again, the sacrifice of World War I. These two nationalist leaders were arrested and removed from India. And in response to that, the Indian people take to the streets and mount this very peaceful protest. And in response to that, the British Army fires upon the crowd and kills hundreds of protesters, wounding thousands more. This was a peaceful protest. The protesters were not armed, and their protest was in the cause of nationalism, self-determination, things that, again, the British saw as values associated with their nation. This, too, is one of the many ironies of colonialism, that nations that are often so in rhetoric committed to independence and self-rule are the ones that often are employed in a colonial effort to deny people self-rule. One of those contradictions, like we saw in U.S. rule in the Philippines. The Amritsar massacre has a number of effects. It is right on top of these very recent reminders, markers that came out of World War I that, again, demonstrated to the Indian people that their colonial master is callous to their suffering, whether it was the effects at home of the wartime economy or the sacrifice made by Indian troops in service in World War I. So it's April of 1919. The war has just recently, within months, ended, and the war was very demanding on the Indian populace. They made true sacrifices, and yet they were not treated as equal members of the British Empire. They were fighting for the British. They were serving. They were making the same sacrifice that British citizens and soldiers were making, but because of the color of their skin, they were treated as inferior. And then on top of that, you have this massacre that seemed to all over again confirm the idea that Indian bodies were expendable. That in the wake of a peaceful protest, the response of the British is to open fire and kill people. Again, just months after Indian bodies had fallen on the Western Front in Europe. It was another reminder of the callous sentiment of the British, the way in which they thought of Indian people as expendable, inferior, worthless. Furthermore, this was a protest in the case of nationalism. What were the Indian people calling for? Certainly they were protesting the arrest of these two leaders, but again, what they wanted was freedom, independence, self-rule. They were seeking what people in the early 20th century around the world increasingly see as their right. Nationalism is contagion. It's spreading around the globe. People become increasingly convinced that they have a right to an independent nation of their own. Traditional societies are toppled in Russia. There are uprisings in Serbia seeking independence. Self-rule and independence becomes the watchwords of the Paris Peace Conference. The Indian people are seeking that, and they're doing so in peaceful means, and where they get a bullet in their body, shot and killed. So that too was one of the consequences of the Amritsar massacre. It seemed to indicate that Great Britain is going to do whatever it takes to deny these people what Indian people and people around the world are convinced is their right: independence, self-rule, sovereignty, a nation of their own, a destiny of their own. And then finally, when the aftermath of the massacre played out, when an investigation was held, the British officer who was directly responsible for this massacre went without any punishment. And so that only amplifies the sense of callousness, indifference that the massacre itself demonstrated. There was this atrocity, and then there was an atrocity on top of that where the person who was responsible for this was basically let off. In fact, he was valorized and celebrated in Great Britain as someone who did something admirable, even though he fired upon an unarmed, peaceful crowd. So the Amritsar massacre demonstrated to the Indian people that their British colonial master doesn't care for them in any way. In fact, sees them as expendable. Right on top of that same lesson that was articulated in World War I. Then it was another keen reminder that they're being actively denied something that human beings are increasingly convinced is their birthright: freedom, independence, a nation of their own. And then no one is punished for this cruelty. And so the Amritsar massacre created martyrs. It created people who lost their lives for that cause, who were gunned down by the British, who are indifferent to the suffering of the Indian people and unwilling to punish those responsible for that suffering. So it's really hard to overstate the importance of the Amritsar massacre. And I want to tack back to this idea of martyrdom. Martyrdom is also very important in the story of nationalism. Most nations have martyrs. They have figures who they revere because they died, because they were killed, because they made that sacrifice. We've talked in this class about this idea of nationalism as an imagined community, that you have to learn to think of yourself as part of a nation. It's cultural. It is inherited. It is taught anew. And as part of that process of teaching nationalism, learning to think of yourself as part of a nation, a lot of that involves martyrdom. It involves this idea of people in the past who died for you. Almost every nation has a martyr. I've talked a lot, because of my own research interests, about the Philippines and Jose Rizal, who is executed by the Spanish in 1896, and his death, much more than his life, certainly, sparks the revolution against the Spanish. When Rizal is killed, his last words are "est consummatum," which purportedly were the last words of Christ as he died on the cross, making him a martyr. Here in the United States, one of our martyrs, Abraham Lincoln, who was killed by a white supremacist in April of 1865 on Good Friday, the day that Christians commemorate the death of Christ, making Lincoln, who was not a very popular president in many segments of the North, let alone the South, a martyr. A man who was seen to have died for our sins, the sin of slavery. And so many nations have these figures who serve as martyrs, and the importance of that is that martyrs die for a cause. They don't just get killed, and that itself is tragic. They get killed for a cause that goes unfulfilled until those who live on after their death take up that cause. So martyrdom is a really rich and interesting element of nationalism, because the death that you are urged to respect, commemorate, is a debt that you inherit. Here in India, you have martyrdom, 376 people killed, and what did they die for? They died for freedom and independence. And if we don't achieve that, if we don't pick up that call, honor that debt, they will have died in vain. So in this class, we talk a lot about nationalism, because nationalism is such a key force in modern global history. It certainly is vital to the story that we're telling now at this point in the class in regards to decolonization. And one of the substrata of nationalism, martyrdom. And maybe you can think of some other nations that have these figures that serve as martyrs. With the Amritsar massacre, you have that martyrdom in India, and that sense of a cause that must go forward. Another thing that we have seen in other lectures in other parts of the world is how a lot of these transformations, in this case the decolonization of India, goes forward when a certain individual comes along who can crystallize a lot of this messy sea of sentiment, the various undercurrents below them. We've seen that earlier with figures like Lenin and Hitler. In the case of Indian decolonization, in the aftermath of the Amritsar massacre, with all the consequences to that massacre that I just explained, there would emerge such a figure, Mohandas Gandhi, who would be that figure upon which a variety of different elements of Indian society with different concerns could rally around as the leader of their movement. Gandhi was born in 1869. He was educated as a figure emerging in colonial India as one of this rising figures in the middle class, the intellectual class that we've been talking about. He traveled to England and was educated at the elite schools in England. He had that experience that we've talked about earlier about a smart individual who goes to study in these elite institutions who is treated as inferior, even though he's there on the campus of these elite universities simply because of the color of his skin. Gandhi thought of himself as just as smart, even smarter than many of the students at these universities, but they always looked down upon him simply because of his religion or the color of his skin. This is that phenomenon we've seen earlier when figures go abroad and they become keenly, sharply aware of nationalism, of their own nationalism, because they are never treated as equals abroad, even though they are right there on the campus of these elite institutions. Gandhi studied law, and he went and lived for some time in another British colony in South Africa. And that too was very eye-opening for Gandhi. He saw in the relations between the British colonialists and the black population in South Africa the same racism, the same bigotry that he became keenly aware of himself while in England. He saw the British in another context, in their rule in South Africa, as again motivated by the forces of racism, bigotry, and cruelty as they enacted colonial rule over the black majority in South Africa, denied them freedom, independence. And so Gandhi's sensibilities are deepening. His understanding of an anti-colonial way of thinking is also developing. He's increasingly seeing the British as, again, cruel, racist, bigoted, and fully committed, whether it is India or South Africa, to denying human beings freedom and independence. So this is Gandhi's personal story. This is his biography that makes him a nationalist, an anti-colonialist, in his experiences as an aspiring figure, intellectual, lawyer, who, whether it was in England or in South Africa, saw in his own eyes the terrible, terrible ravages of colonialism. Then you have the Amritsar massacre and this growing sentiment in a larger population in India that the British must go. Gandhi becomes the leader of that effort of Indian nationalism, and he advocates a strategy of confrontation with the British through determination, an unyielding commitment to independence, but a modus operandi, a strategy of non-violent confrontation. And in doing so, Gandhi summoned forth deep-rooted traditions in India of nonviolence, of a commitment to such efforts. This is the many, many different facets of Gandhi, why he would become such an effective leader. Because Gandhi could be many things to different people. He, again, could be one individual that crystallizes a number of energies. Mohandas Gandhi was an intellectual. He was a man schooled in modernity, modern ways of thinking. While in South Africa, he wore a Western suit and tie. But he could also tap into folk traditions, religious traditions in India. So he was simultaneously modern, educated, intellectual, able to adapt to the very dress, not only speech and manners and ways of Europeans, but also very Indian, very much rooted in Indian traditions. He was a Rorschach test in some ways. You saw what you wanted to see. And that really is the way in which he could simultaneously build support among members of the Indian National Congress, intellectuals. He was one of them. He was an educated, intellectual, lawyer, and advocate for the modernization, independence of India. So people of that background and ilk could rally around Gandhi. He's one of us. But at the same time, Gandhi could be a hero to the common people of India, the undereducated masses, in the way in which he tapped into deep-rooted traditions, in this instance, including commitments to nonviolence. But do not confuse nonviolence with passivity, because Gandhi was very aggressive, very assertive in his command. He would not support violent insurrection against the British, but he absolutely supported confronting the British, refusing to obey their demands. He was unwavering in his commitment to using nonviolent means, but he was also unwavering in his commitment to ending British colonial rule. So refuse to pay taxes to a government that doesn't represent you. Refuse to vote in the sham elections that offer the appearance but not reality of self-rule. Refuse to obey laws that treat you as inferior, as unworthy of self-governance. Don't pick up a rifle. Don't pick up a sword. Don't storm in a violent way the seats of government, but do not respect a government that does not respect you. And this was the strategy that Gandhi employed. Related to this, another form of dogged, determined, but nonviolent resistance, boycotts. And boycotts are very key in terms of driving forward a mass commitment, a concerted commitment to change. Boycotts have proven very effective in human history in mounting efforts at greater justice and change, because they are initially rooted in a sense of us, community, and then the enforcement and application of boycotts builds further community. In a boycott, you rally people together who are commonly aggrieved. So you begin with a basis of connection, of community. We are the people who are angry about something. We are the people who are aggrieved about something. We are the people who are collectively injured. So the boycott begins with a sense of us. And then you say, as the group who are aggrieved, we are going to refuse to patronize. We are going to refuse to buy a good or service. We're going to launch a boycott. And what that does is it forces everyone else to pick sides. Are you with us or against us? Because now you have to make a choice. Do you continue to patronize? Do you continue to buy that product? And in doing so, cleave towards the oppressor, or do you join with the boycotters? And that's what I meant about how boycotts begin with a sense of us, community connection, and then build it. Because it's an absolute. You have to pick sides. If you are every day buying a certain product, or every day patronizing a service, and then all of a sudden there's a boycott against that service, well, you have a real stark, absolute choice. Do you continue to buy that product that you've been buying each and every day, and in doing so cleave to one side of this political campaign? Or do you join with the boycotters? It's what you learned about in junior high, right? Peer pressure. That absolute choice to pick sides. Whose side are you on? And that's why boycotts have often been effective as efforts by the powerless against the powerful, because they build a coalition, they build a movement. Some of you who are conversant, familiar with U.S. history, may know a great deal about the Montgomery bus boycott, the effort that took place in the 1950s by African Americans to boycott a public transportation system that did not serve the public, it segregated the public, or the efforts of Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez in the Boycott Grapes campaign here in the United States in the 60s and 70s to put pressure on the billionaire growers to recognize the right of farm workers to unionize. Those were efforts, like those in India, launched by Gandhi, of the powerless, people who didn't have access to political power, but were able to enact change because of the way in which boycotts build a movement, fold people in with that absolute choice. And so Gandhi also, as part of his nonviolent resistance, along with refusing to pay taxes, vote in sham elections, follow unjust laws, launched these campaigns, these boycotts against British-produced goods, putting pressure on the British by hitting them in the wallet, but more importantly, perhaps, building a large coalition. That's Gandhi's real significance, the way in which he could be everything to everyone. He could build a strong coalition that could advance this cause of independence, vault beyond an intellectual movement dedicated to issues of politics, couched and expressed in modern words and ideologies, and build a movement that folded in rural people, farmers, shopkeepers. Gandhi was really able to be that Rorschach test, where in one instance he would be comfortable in a Western suit speaking about liberalism and constitutional republics, and then in another moment dress in traditional garb and employ religious symbolism and other markers, other forms of language that connected with rural people who never read John Locke, who never attend a university. Gandhi employed a variety of means to connect with common people. And in particular, he suffered. He often went on hunger strikes in protest. Again, nonviolent. But something that builds a coalition, builds sympathy, employs the politics of suffering. Think back to what we said earlier about martyrdom and how the death of others affects you, how the death of others helps to advance forward a movement. Well, Gandhi suffered willfully, went on hunger strikes, deprived himself in order to advance a larger cause, and that had a number of effects. It employed, again, many traditional elements of Indian society that were rooted in notions of suffering, willful suffering, to motivate people who, again, were not educated elites to join in this larger effort. Gandhi had this ability to connect with common people, even though he himself was an educated intellectual elite. He had this ability to connect with common people through religiosity, through customs, through his appearance as simple and modest, often appearing nearly naked in a way that connected with the impoverished classes in India, and also his employ of religiosity with long-standing Hindu traditions of suffering, of abstinence, of willful denial, and nonviolence. But one of the consequences of his open employ of religious symbolism and religiosity was that it tended to alienate other nationalists in India. So I've been talking a lot in this slide about the galvanizing ability of Gandhi, how he could be a nucleus, a center that could draw in many different Indians from different backgrounds, rural, urban, educated, undereducated, religious, secular. But one group of nationalists had concerns about Gandhi, particularly in the way in which he employed religiosity as part of this galvanizing effort. Muslims. We've been talking earlier in the lecture about Muslim nationalists, the Muslim League, and from the early 20th century, their misgivings about an independent India where they would be a permanent minority. And now that movement seems to be centered on an individual, Gandhi, who openly employs Hinduism and Hindu symbolism and Hindu religiosity as part of a nationalist effort. So what this does is it further convinces Muslims that Indian independence, Indian nationalism, is deeply tied to Hinduism. And what does that mean for us? If the British leave, are we going to be in a similar state as now a minority in a Hindu majority where we continue to have a lack of independence and self-rule? So that's the other side, the other element here of Gandhi's religiosity. It certainly unified and galvanized many, but it alienated others. Despite the efforts of Gandhi and the growing popular movement for independence, the British remained intransigent and refused to accept the idea of an independent India or lose what has long been seen as the crown jewel of the British Empire, their prized possession in Asia, India. And so the efforts of Gandhi and others were met but with British intransigence, unwillingness to accept the end of British rule in India. They attempted to placate the calls for independence, the mounting calls for independence, in 1935 with a new constitution in India that created a legislature that could, quote unquote, this is the language of the Constitution, assist the Governor General, the Viceroy appointed by the British. What does assist mean? Well, it doesn't mean much, right? So this was a very transparent effort by the British to throw a bone to the nationalists in an effort, hopefully, to stop the boycotts and pressure mounted by Gandhi and others. This doesn't change the lived reality for the Indian people. It certainly does not in any way move towards the end of British rule. It simply creates a legislature that has no power. It creates a legislature that could be comprised of Indian people who have absolutely no say. So it isn't independence. It is even a modest step towards independence. It's, again, a very transparent effort by the British to try to placate this growing independence movement by offering them something that is only symbolic. Gandhi embraced the compromise as a step towards independence. He believed that the pressure was working and that the British were responding. Gandhi remained committed to a nonviolent approach that was the long game, that would involve sacrifice, persistence, and so he ultimately reconciled himself to this lack of independence that came with the Constitution of 1935 as a slow but important step towards gaining some concessions from the British. It was clear to Gandhi that his efforts were working. The British were alarmed and worried. He knew the British could not hold on to India forever. It was the Great Depression. It was the 1930s. And with that, Gandhi believed that soon the British will have to take further action. And he wanted to appear to be a partner in that effort, and so accepted this hollow, empty gesture by the British. But this proved to be divisive among the Indian National Congress, among the leading nationalists. Others refused to accept this, including Jawaharlal Nehru, who emerges as well as a key figure in India's independence and will become the first president of an independent India. And he occupies an important place in the national pantheon of India as an uncompromised leader, someone who didn't go along with this effort. So the British continue to employ a strategy that pit groups against each other, splintering here the nationalists with their hollow gesture to establish a legislature to assist the governor. The Indian National Congress, now increasingly led by Nehru, who emerges really as this unalloyed, uncompromised voice, continues to put pressure on Great Britain. Independence now. Then World War II breaks out, and Great Britain is swept up into that crisis. Now, in World War II, the Indian people refuse to serve in that war effort. they use this moment of crisis to further that campaign against the British. They learned the lessons of World War I, where their sons died on the Western Front for naught. They learned the lessons of the Amritsar massacre, where in the aftermath of one sacrifice made in World War I, hundreds of people are killed. And this is a key moment because it demonstrates this growing sentiment in India against the British. As they boycotted participation in World War II, Indian bodies would not die once again for a British government that treated them as unworthy of self-rule and independence. At the same time, the Muslim League continues lobbying for an independent Muslim state, arguing that in the process of ending British colonial rule, they must be able to also secure independence, self-rule, something they believe will be impossible as a permanent minority in a Hindu majority. 1945, World War II comes to an end. The end of World War II, Winston Churchill, who was the leader of the Tory party, Prime Minister of Great Britain for most of World War II, is rewarded for his leadership in World War II, shepherding the British people through that crisis by being removed from office. The Labour Party, the opposition party to Churchill's Tory party, made major gains at the end of World War II, took control of Parliament, and under their leadership would vote to grant India independence. Remember, Great Britain at the end of World War II had been weakened by 2 world wars. It was receding in power. It was also, of course, under great pressure from local people in their empire, whether it was Africa or Asia, for independence. And the Labour Party was much more inclined towards domestic concerns in a nation that was badgered by World War I and World War II. We need to rebuild the British society and economy after World War II. Labour Party was not made up of diehard imperialists like Churchill and the Tory party, and as a result, this party, now much more inclined towards Indian independence, would grant that independence in 1945. So, unlike what we saw with the French in Algeria and Vietnam, the British, under the leadership of the Labour Party, a party in Great Britain that was more inclined towards dismantling the empire, more concerned with domestic policies and crises, voted to end Indian independence. So you wouldn't have like a war in Algeria as the French are trying to hold on to Algeria. The British voted to end their empire in India, but they did so because of the effects of World War I, World War II, but most importantly, the dogged, determined efforts of Indians who mounted this campaign since the late 19th century for independence. The British were certainly weakened. They certainly were in no position to continue trying to coercively hold on to India and the amount of effort that would take. But of course, that effort would be so demanding because the Indian people were resisting British colonialism. With India now independent, it would fracture into 2 separate states, making India different than some of the other case studies of decolonization we've encountered in this class. 2 nation states would emerge out of British colonial India, India with its Hindu majority, and Pakistan with its Muslim majority. So throughout this lecture we've been stressing there are 2 groups lobbying for independence. There are the Hindus in India who formed the Indian National Congress, and then there's the Muslim League representing nationalists who are concerned about, again, only one nation emerging where they would be a permanent minority. Solution to this was to create 2 nation states, and this helps create the modern nation states of India and Pakistan. Great Britain leaves in 1947. So in 45, they vote to end British colonial rule. It takes them 2 years to withdraw. And as they do so, in August of 1947, you have one of the great calamities of the 20th century. A great partition which involved a mass migration of 12 million people. Muslims in India didn't want to be left behind and indeed endure what they saw as being a minority in a Hindu majority. So they want to make their way from what was to be the now modern nation state of India to Pakistan. They have to migrate. Muslims in what will become Pakistan to establish that nation, and then Hindus want to be in India where they'll be the majority. So in what was to become Pakistan, you have Hindus migrating to what will become India. So you get this massive migration of millions of people, and it becomes chaotic. People are unable to make it to their destination. They get left behind. They're effectively refugees with really no place to go or be. Violence flares throughout the country. Hundreds of thousands of people die, making this a huge human tragedy. The British just leave, and they say, all right, we're going to divide this colony into two nation states. You guys figure it out. And there's such suspicion and worry and fear, uncertainty here among these groups that it leads to this mass migration where Hindus want to be in India, Muslims want to be in Pakistan, and poor people without any means are trekking across the nation so that they could be in the nation state of their choice. And it ends in a great human tragedy. People die, hundreds of thousands. People are left behind as refugees. Families are fractured. So this too is something we have encountered in previous lectures. It's another key insight in regards to decolonization. Decolonization means the realization of a hope and aspiration of colonized people, in some cases for decades, independence. But just when the colonizer leaves, new problems rise to the surface. Many of those problems, the legacies of colonialism. Through the history of British colonialism in India, the British deliberately pitted Muslims and Hindus against each other. Because remember, the last thing that colonizers want is unity among the colonized. They want to fracture these societies. They want to play into religious, ethnic, linguistic divisions, because it becomes a lot easier for the colonizer to conquer and control a colony. So colonialism involves fracturing existing societies, aggrandizing, deepening cleavages and divides. It was very advantageous to the British to foment religious opposition. The religious opposition we see between Hindus and Muslims isn't because of long-standing religious divisions. A lot of, again, that ontological way of thinking that prevails in American media. These people are just like this. They're always angry at each other. They're always fighting. It's all about religion. That's part of our inability to see history, our inability to see colonialism and its legacies. We talked about this earlier in our study of Africa, how Africa remains a dark continent in the historical understanding and imagination of Americans, how there's this very sloppy, racist way of thinking and representation that prevails in our media that often discounts history. And that's true in regards to India. We often see this as purely a religious problem, right? That these are religious groups who hate each other, right? Well, that completely ignores the history of British colonialism, where the British deliberately created and advanced and deepened these antagonisms. It was very profitable to the British to pit Muslims and Indians against each other. And then in 1947, the British pull out and they leave that behind. And you have these suspicions, these misgivings, these fears of Hindus living in Pakistan, Muslims living in India. They feel as if they have no choice but to trek for hundreds of miles to live in nations that reflect their religious populations. And in the process of doing this, you get this great human tragedy. So independence, an end to British colonialism, but these modern nation states of India and Pakistan inherit these legacies of colonialism that trouble these nations to this very day. The legacies of colonialism involve pitting groups against each other, aggrandizing, deepening religious divisions. The legacies of colonialism involve underdevelopment, asymmetries in wealth and power, a large uneducated, impoverished class. The reason why poverty, illiteracy, plague many of these nations is because of colonialism, where there was a vested interest in educating a few and denying education to others. So India and Pakistan, now into the 21st century, wrestle with these consequences of colonialism. They're independent, they have their own nations. India is the largest democracy on earth. It is a nation that is a democracy where everyone can vote. But it's also a nation that struggles with these problems of poverty, underdevelopment, illiteracy, this problem of governing a massive nation of 1 billion people, a population that is very heterogeneous, where fractures and divisions were again advanced and deepened during the colonial period. And so India is a very interesting story because it is a democracy, it is an independent nation, it is a thriving and advancing nation, but it's also a nation plagued by many deeply rooted problems associated with colonialism, and most recently, an inclination towards a heavy-handed government as a response to that. The current government in India very much reflects this growing trend we have seen around the nation and in our own nation towards a more authoritarian government. And the problem again with that is that we tend to see this through a Western media lens that says, oh, that's the only way to govern such a nation, right? Because of all the religious differences. No. It's one, a trend that is rising around the globe and in our own nation. And it's also, again, a product not of the ontology of these people or their religious beliefs, but again, the legacies of colonialism. Let's here in our final slide reflect on decolonization in Asia by comparing our two case studies in that part of the world, China and India. Let's begin with some similarities. Both nations, huge, large populations, heterogeneous populations, but populations that are deeply stratified, with a few who are educated and the many who are undereducated. Both nations deeply influenced by long-standing foreign intervention that, again, extracted wealth, that developed these economies in line with the interest of export markets that benefited the mother country. China was colonized by European powers, the United States, who sought access to China's markets and certain goods. India, colonized by the British with a very similar pattern. So you have that colonial history of colonial exploitation, oppression, pitting groups against each other, rewarding few, punishing the many. But out of that comes those few who are committed to modernization, nationalism, who employ these modern concepts of the nation state. Liberalism, in the case of Mao Zedong, communism, and they naturalize them. They domesticate them for the specific concerns of both nations. Mao Zedong was a communist who studied Marx, but he couched that communism in a way that connected with local people in China. That's what I mean by domesticated a foreign way of thinking. He made it applicable to Chinese peasants in promising them land reform. And Mohandas Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Indian nationalists, took foreign concepts and communicated them in a way in India that would resonate with the local population. This too is a lesson we could take away from this class, that ideas may originate in one part of the world, but they mean different things in different contexts, and they can be changed, manipulated, grafted anew onto other populations far away from their origins. A point I made very early in the class, that the origin of idea doesn't really matter much. Sometimes we obsess on that, particularly in American culture that likes to turn inventors and pioneers into heroes. The person who comes up with an idea, well, that's important, But once the idea is out there, it's no longer theirs anymore. And it goes through many different manipulations. Sometimes these manipulations are nefarious, like we saw with Adolf Hitler, taking existing tropes and ideas of anti-Semitism and using them for the specific context of post-World War I Germany. In other instances, foreign ideas can be used in the cause of independence and decolonization. And you saw that in both India, in the efforts of Indian nationalists, many of whom were Western educated or educated in Europe, who domesticated that call for independence in a way that would resonate with local people, the way Gandhi could connect with images of Hindu religiosity and folk traditions in India, and the way in which Mao Zedong could articulate a very Chinese vision of communism and economic change. Differences. India was an effort led by religious leaders like Gandhi and liberalism, an image of an independent nation state in India that would mimic many British forms of governance, with a prime minister, with a legislature, the Westminster model of government, a bicameral legislature, but of course comprised of Indian people. It's again domesticating the foreign in the local context. And India would emerge as an independent state with a constitution, a liberal government, and a democracy. India, though, would be partitioned into two states, India and Pakistan. And so religious divisions could not fit within one nation state. And you have instead two nation states as a result. But as I've stressed in this lecture, it's important to think of these religious differences and divisions not as primordial, as something that's always existed, rooted deeply in the ontology of these people, but instead a direct result of British colonialism. Ultimately, in India, independence was secured non-violently, but in the partition of India, violence prevailed and hundreds of thousands of people died. So it would be wholly inaccurate to say that the story of Indian independence is how nonviolent protests can ultimately prevail, because Great Britain is responsible for the violence that came with that great partition. And great violence took place in the actual creation of two independent nation states. India, as I've said today, is the largest democracy on earth. And in many ways, it is a democracy where all people, regardless of gender or religion or class standing, can vote. But of course, there have been troubling trends within the Indian government recently, trends that are, again, very common around the world, not just in India, towards a more authoritarian form of governance. Contrast that with China, which saw a division within the nationalist class, not between Muslims and Hindus, but radicals like Mao Zedong, communists committed to a complete overthrow and creation of a new communist state, and the liberalism advanced by Sun Yat-sen and then his successor, Chiang Kai-shek. Their independence was secured through violence and a long, long string of violence that began with the Boxer Rebellion, continued through the warring period in the interwar era after World War I in the 20s and 30s, furthered by the Japanese invasion and the onset of World War II, a civil war that finally ends in 1949. And so China's emergence as an independent state, one that took decades of violence. Violence within China, violence that came with a foreign invasion and a new effort of colonization. The Japanese were trying to be the next to colonize China, and it took a war of liberation to decolonize China from Japanese control. And then after the Japanese are defeated in 1945, 4 more years of civil war. So India experienced violence in 1947, the Great Partition. China, though, experienced a long wave of violence that ultimately led to the creation of the modern Chinese state in 1949, a state that is not a democracy, a communist dictatorship that, as I've said in our lecture on the decolonization of China, fails to yield to calls for greater civil liberties and instead has used increasingly repressive means against liberalization in their society. And that too is one of the worrying trends towards authoritarianism around the globe, just in a different form in China. So similarities and some key differences.